Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying your second day off in a row of school. Um, I made a couple of videos though that can help us kind of unpack this material that we're talking about. In this video, I'm going to go over the concepts of sovereignty and constitution, briefly recap the Articles of Confederation, and then talk about the Constitutional Convention and questions over representation and compromises. So first, when I say constitution, whoops. So first, when I say constitution, remember this is like a rule book, right? You have to have a series of rules for how a government will organize itself, how it will make rules, and how it will operate, right? So Congress has the power to tax. The president has the power to negotiate treaties. The Supreme Court has the power to solve disputes, right? So we're talking about the Constitution that the United States established in 1787, which is still the rule book for how the United States government can operate today. This over 240-year-old document still sets the rules and grounds for what different branches of the government can do today. But remember, it was not the first constitution, right? The first one was called the Articles of Confederation. The idea proposed by Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson, passed at the end of the Revolutionary War, lasted for 6 years, but as we see, the Articles of Confederation didn't suffice. They weren't all that powerful, and eventually were repealed at the Constitutional Convention. But first, going over sovereignty, right? You're going to hear me talk about this in the video. What are some small examples of sovereignty, right? This woman having control over her daughter, telling her what to do, right? That's a kind of an example of sovereignty. A coach telling his players what to do. He has power over them, kind of telling them what to do, right? Me in the classroom, haha, telling you guys what to do. But remember, Lord of the Rings, when you see a teacher outside of school, you have no power here. Okay, right? So where does sovereignty exist in the United States? In the 13 colonies. Well, New York has sovereignty over New York. That means if the New York legislature passes a law and the governor signs it, that is the law in New York. Same thing. Virginia has sovereignty in Virginia. Georgia over Georgia. The new United States federal government had sovereignty over the 13 colonies. But as we're going to see, it really didn't have the power to do hardly anything, which was a major reason why ultimately they had to be thrown out the window. So this kind of gets into the idea of federalism, right? Separation of powers. States govern themselves at the state level, and the U.S. governs all the states at the federal level. You can also think of federalism as the division of power between the federal government and the states. So briefly recapping the Articles of Confederation, remember there was a Congress, one legislative branch with only one chamber though, which could make laws, but there was no executive branch. Remember, the creators of the Articles of Confederation were wary and fearful that a president might turn into a monarch, so they deliberately left an executive branch out of its constitution under the Articles. And there also wasn't any Supreme Court, no one to interpret the laws. Also under the Articles, one state got one vote, so we'll come back to this later, but Virginia, with a population of over 100,000, they got one vote. Delaware only got one vote with a population of just 11,000. Congress could declare war under the Articles. They could appoint military officers. They could coin money. 9 out of the 13 states needed to approve before laws could be passed. But a big problem under the Articles, Congress couldn't tax the states, right? It simply had to ask for money from the states. And the states had the option of refusing Congress, which most of them did. This is going to be a huge problem later on because remember, we talked about this earlier, the United States was in debt following the Revolutionary War. It needed to pay back countries that it had borrowed money from, like the Netherlands, and they didn't have money to pay it back. So that's a huge problem right away. Congress could not regulate trade. There wasn't a president and there wasn't a judicial branch. So here are all kinds of problems under the Articles of Confederation. We talked about earlier Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. These are all signs that the United States needs to come up with. So they get the Constitutional Convention, a meeting of delegates in Philadelphia in 1787. 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates. Rogue Island didn't show up in order to revise the Articles. Why? The United States was in debt. It needed to pay back their money, and they needed a strong executive to enforce the laws. They met at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is the same building where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and it's kind of cut off from the picture. I don't really know why, my bad. But this is a painting, The Signing of the Constitution by Howard Chandler Christie. You see this, it's in the US Capitol today. And you kind of get an idea of what the room may have looked like. George Washington, this guy right here, was the president of the convention. They elected him because he was a war hero. A lot of people trusted him to make sound decisions. You have James Madison, the guy that wrote the Constitution, or most of it. He's sitting right here. Benjamin Franklin at 81 was the oldest delegate. He was also there. And whispering into his ear is everybody's favorite, Hamilton, who was a strong proponent of the Constitution. So there were problems that the convention had to deal with, and one of them right away involved representation. All right, so this would be the first of two compromises that we talk about. You'll remember that under the Articles, each state had one vote, right? So, and by the way, these numbers are representing free white property owners at the time. This is excluding women, it's excluding slaves. Virginia has a population 10 times the size of that as Delaware. And under the Articles, they got one vote. And they said, you know what, that's not fair. We have a state 10 times the size of Delaware. We should get more votes. So large states thought that voting should be based on population. So Virginia's thinking, because we have such a large population, we should have 10 votes. And Delaware, a smaller state, they should get one vote. But small states thought they should keep voting the same way, kind of the status quo under the Articles. They thought Virginia should get one vote and Delaware should get one vote. So you get questions right away. Big states want voting in the new legislative branch to be proportional. That is, the larger the state, the more votes it gets. So Edmund Randolph and James Madison, both from Virginia, proposed the Virginia Plan. The bigger the population, the more votes it gets. New York and Virginia, with big states, they get 10 votes apiece. New Hampshire and Delaware, smaller states, they should get 5 and 3 votes apiece respectively. So this made the big states, Pharrell Williams, happy, and this made the small states, Clash Royale, angry. By the way, if this sounds like the House of Representatives, you're onto something. Okay? But smaller states wanted equal representation in the new legislative branch. They kind of wanted the exact same thing under the Articles of Confederation. That is, each state gets the same number of votes no matter what. So William Patterson proposes the New Jersey Plan. All states will get one vote, no matter the size. This made big states, Clash Royale, angry. This made small states, Pharrell Williams, happy. This probably sounds like the Senate, right? You might be onto something. Okay, so you have big states that want one plan and small states that want another plan. What do? You compromise. So Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who you all think looks really kind of scary, and granted in this painting he kind of does, he suggested that Congress be bicameral. This is an important word, meaning 2 chambers. One in the House of Representatives, where voting is proportional, and one in the Senate, where voting will be equal among all states. So in 1787, they literally come up with the idea for the form of government that exists today. You have the legislative branch, Congress is the capital, this chamber, the House, where big states have more votes than smaller states, and you have the Senate here, where each state, regardless of the size, has 2 votes. So that's kind of an example of checks and balances built into the government right away. So now we're going to talk about the 3/5 compromise. Problems over large and small states were resolved, but the bigger problem of the day, and this problem that's going to persist from the Constitutional Convention up until the outbreak of the Civil War, is going to involve slavery, even though no one talked about slavery. Right? James Madison himself said, "It seemed now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lay not between large and small states, between the North and the South." Remember, most of the northern states at this time had outlawed slavery, whereas in the South it was still a big booming business. So the 3/5 compromise. Southern states who maintained slaves recognized that if they counted their slaves in the census, they would have a larger population and would therefore be awarded more seats in the House of Representatives. I encourage you to pause the video and kind of look at this illustration here. I think it does a great job. You can see that large states like Virginia look at its population, yellow representing free, red enslaved, 3/5 compromise, which we'll talk about. Look at the population here. See, all these people aren't being counted in the census, and Virginia suddenly says, hey, if we count them, we're going to get more representation in the House. So southern states like Virginia, like North Carolina, like Maryland, they say, hey, we would like to count our slaves. If you count what is in red, southern states will have more representatives in the House. But the northern states say, well, look, a slave has no rights, can't vote. Why should that person be included in the census? They said, no, you shouldn't be able to count them. So you have this argument between the North and the South. The North says, no, you can't count them. The South says, yes, you can count them. So they come to a middle ground and basically say, okay, for every 5 slaves that you have, these illustrations represent people being slaves, 3 of them can be counted to bolster representation in the southern states. Why not all 5? Well, the North said, we don't want you guys to have too much power in the House, therefore you should only be able to count 3 out of the 5. This went into writing, and this was the law of the land for a long time. Still, disagreements over slavery plagued the convention. You had 3 more agreements, in short, and this will be the end of the video. 1, Congress would disallow the importation of slaves beginning in 1807. That means that slavery will still exist in the United States, but you can't import any more slaves after 1807 from other parts of the world. It forbade citizens to prevent the return of fugitive slaves, and it also disallowed slavery in the Northwest Territory. So again, in order to get the Constitution, these were kind of the agreements that the delegates made.